Today we're going to be going over several good things and several bad things that happened during the civil rights era, predominantly in the 1960s. We're going to be referencing each one of these vocabulary terms, but they're all pretty self-explanatory. So again, we'll start here, start writing, continue to write as I begin explaining. Now we start with the Freedom Summer. This is called Freedom Summer because of the time of the year it was, which is in the summer of 1964. And it starts with a bunch of different organizations coming into the South. This is after the Civil Rights Act is passed, and they're trying to get African Americans registered to vote and get them out to vote. Obviously, they're going to face some pushback from white Southerners. The greatest example of this was a trio, 3 individuals, 2 white Americans and 1 African American, traveled down from Chicago to a small town in Mississippi to get African Americans registered to vote, and the locals in the town murdered them and tried to cover it up. There's a huge federal investigation into it. There's a movie about it called Mississippi Burning. Little dramatized, but still the basic facts are there. Also, during this summer, that's when Martin Luther King and the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, decide to organize the March on Selma. So they're going to march from Selma, Alabama, all the way to Montgomery, trying to bring attention to and trying to get Alabama to protect civil rights of African Americans, especially voting rights, because of all this turmoil that was happening during the summer. During the march, state and local law enforcement of Selma and Montgomery in the state of Alabama decide that they want to try and stop this protest, and it results in many police officers violently attacking the protesters. The problem for local and state law enforcement is that this is on national television. During the nightly news that night, they're showing clips of people like John Lewis being beaten by these officers. And so this starts changing the national narrative, along with other media coverage of Southern law enforcement harassing individuals during these protests. And this can be like videos of police officers turning fire hoses on protesters, allowing their police dogs to attack protesters, and then that's on national news. There's pictures that get printed in all the papers. So it changes how the whole country saw the plight of African Americans, particularly in the South, and starts changing things on the national level. So same as in 1964, we get the Civil Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Shortly after the Freedom Summer, in the turn of 1965, you get the Voting Rights Act, which is it stops discriminatory practices like having to take a literacy test in order to vote, or the old grandfather clause saying is that if your grandfather was a free person and was able to vote, then you could vote, which of course disqualified hundreds of thousands of African Americans from voting all throughout the South. As soon as the Voting Rights Act is passed, African American voting numbers immediately shoot up to the levels that they were at the very beginning of Reconstruction, when African Americans had been given the right to vote following freedom and emancipation. Also in 18 political victories following the Freedom Summer is the 24th Amendment, which cancels poll taxes in order to vote. So you don't have to pay any money now to go and vote, which some southern states tried to do. All right, second slide of 3. Following the summer of 1964, a year later in 1965, there was a lot of craziness that was going on throughout the United States. And it would kind of continue on until we get through 1968. But 1965, we see during the summer that all of a sudden riots break out in African American neighborhoods across the country. And these are not in most of them were not in southern states. Most of these are happening in the Northeast and the Midwest and out west. So these are areas that had kind of been ignored by the public during the civil rights movement. And what they bring to the forefront is that whether it's segregation or racist policies were not limited to the South, is that they were nationwide. Then the big example, even though it was not the most violent, but was in the Watts ghetto in Los Angeles. So, or in this case, the Watts neighborhood, in which it was a heavily concentrated African American neighborhood. But in Los Angeles, they were facing, like we said, de facto segregation, and the treatment of people in the Watts neighborhood by the Los Angeles Police Department was horrific. And that's a trend that we're still trying to work on across the nation as well. But so this was their plight, their attempt to bring notice to what was happening to them. And it worked because after the riots were stopped, Congress and the president decided they're going to start a commission called the Kerner Commission, which is going to investigate why these riots happened. Now, the commission comes back after doing an intensive study and literally tells the nation that there are deep-seated problems in the United States that are racially motivated, that extend not just to customs and how people think, but policies that are done in our economic policies, our political policies, and also within law enforcement at all different levels, from local, state, to national. And this commission proposed a lot of changes, but what that requires is somebody in Congress to support the bill or to propose the bill, and then of course Congress has to vote on that bill. And a lot of congressmen at the time, not just from the South, but a lot of them from the South too, tried to prevent those laws from being passed, and most of them did not see the light of day. So it was something that we have been aware of in the United States for dating back to the mid-'60s, but yet there's always pushback from those that don't want to see change in the United States. For African Americans during this time, they had different options for how they wanted to actually be active in the civil rights movement. So before, you had the nonviolent protests that were organized by people like Martin Luther King Jr., but you also see the rise of an organization like the Nation of Islam, which was a Muslim organization that advocated for segregation. But they did that with the idea of black empowerment, of trying to boost black-owned businesses, black-run communities, so on and so forth. And then they also provided their communities with financial support, with food, with shelter. The Black Panthers did the same as well, but they were viewed as a militant organization, which was mainly because they exercised their Second Amendment right and walked around with guns. And their big thing, along with providing community support, was policing their communities, not from each other, but protecting their communities from abusive police practices. And this led to one or two shootouts in the Los Angeles area, specifically among Black Panther, in California. Let me correct that. Not just Los Angeles, but also like around Oakland and so on and so forth. That they ran into altercations with the police, and police officers were shot by Black Panthers, both thinking they were reasonably justified. All right, last slide, and then we're done. Now, continuing with some not so nice things here. So the 1960s, not just over the Freedom Summer, the Summer of Chaos, was that the 1960s saw a number of assassinations. So we've talked about in previous lesson about Medgar Evers, who was a local activist in Mississippi. He's one of the first public assassinations in this civil rights era. And it's one of the reasons why he is very important, along with helping James Meredith get into the University of Mississippi. But he sort of begins this sort of standard of people being assassinated at a vulnerable moment, and attempts by others to stop either their personal progress or the progress of the movement that they're in. So in 1965, Malcolm X, who was a former leader of the Nation of Islam, he had left because of disagreements he had with the organization, as well as corruption that he had found. And he had left, started changing his message to moving away from a segregationist idea, and he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam in 1965. This was a big setback for not only his supporters, but he was beginning to work alongside Martin Luther King, who stays alive until 1968, and who was at that time had changed his focus for moving broader from civil rights to working for better minimum wages, better pay for workers. He was actively working with unions. And that's why he was in Memphis, where he was assassinated in 1968. And of course, that was a gigantic shock to the country. And there was another round of riots in 1968 in many of the same cities that had seen riots in 1965, just out of sheer frustration and grief over all these leaders beginning to die. And then later on in 1968, during the Democratic primaries, presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, who was also assassinated back in 1963, was assassinated in 1968 in Los Angeles. So you have people all over the country, leaders all over the country getting assassinated, not just happening in the South. And these are all blows to the expansion and continuation of the civil rights movement. And what that leaves us with is, what is the legacy of it? Because in some context, particularly if we were just teaching straight out of the textbook, it would be as if, well, the civil rights movement came to a close at the end of the 60s, and it's going to give way to liberation movements later on. But really, the civil rights movement has never ended. And there's been constant issues coming up that we're still trying to figure out. One of the immediate effects of it was, after integrating schools, communities were the federal government and the Civil Rights Commission were seeing that schools weren't integrating properly. So to make sure they did so, they decided to do forced school busing. So they would take kids out of one neighborhood, take them across town, and put them into another school, and vice versa. They'd take some kids out of that school, ship them across town. And a lot of families, particularly white families, did not like this. And there was a lot of protests, a lot of animosity. This continued on through the 1970s and became a great big political issue. And voting rights we're still dealing with today. And I'm just going to leave it with a quick example, and that Louisiana just was dealing with something concerning voting rights. We had to redraw congressional districts so that Louisiana, which is over 30% African American, actually had representation in Congress. So a whole new district was drawn up so that African Americans had adequate representation in their voting for members of Congress. So that just happened. It was approved, like 2 weeks ago. So that's where we're going to leave it today.